Hey there, everyone. Hope you're doing well. We're going to now spend some time talking about this problem behavior and competing behavior pathway, which is really bringing things full circle as far as our tier 3 intervention. So we collected our ABC data, and then we used those data to come up with a hypothesis about what might be maintaining the problem behavior we were seeing, right? We came up with it was attention, or it was escape, or it was tangibles, or it was sensory. Okay, now we're going to take that information and we're going to use it to basically answer the question, what do we do? What's the game plan here? Now we know what's going on with problem behavior. We've got a good guess about what's going on with problem behavior. What do we do about it? Okay, and this is going to involve some components. The first is just sort of spelling out what the typical antecedent behavior consequence pattern that we saw was, right? So this is pretty much going to come right from our ABC data. We just have to do one of these though, okay? So even though we might have seen the behavior happen lots of times and written down lots of different antecedents and lots of different consequences, our goal here is to come up with what the typical antecedent behavior consequence chain might look like. And based on that, what we hypothesize that our function might be. Okay, so if we were to fill that out right now, if we were to take a look at that, let's say that the behavior, and let's see, maybe let's do it in red so it stands out. Let's say that the behavior in question is, it's not red at all. Doesn't matter. Let's say the behavior in question is yelling. Okay, and let's say that we took a look at what was going on with the student in question, and what we saw that yelling was normally happening when the student in our case was doing alone work. Okay, so basically they were sitting at their desk by themselves, expected to work on a worksheet or whatever like that, and then yelling would often happen. Okay, and then as a typical consequence, when the student was at their desk alone doing work and started yelling, the teacher came over and said, like, what's wrong? Right? Let's say that's what's happening. That's probably not that unusual of a pattern of behavior to see sort of play out in the classroom. If we had that kind of thing, remember what we talked about in the video about coming up with a hypothesis of function based on antecedents and consequences, right? And we think about what wasn't present in the environment before the behavior and what was present in the environment after. And we take a look at this, and this is our typical situation. Students doing alone work, so they're by themselves, right? They yell, teacher comes over, says, what's wrong? So we can think about this as a situation where what wasn't taking place over here under the antecedents is there wasn't any attention. Yelling happened, and now the teacher comes over and provides attention. So if we've got that pattern of behavior, it's a reasonable hypothesis to say that behavior is maintained by attention. Okay, that probably makes sense, right? So this is the first piece of figuring out our problem behavior and competing behavior pathway. Okay? Now there's one more thing that we want to think of related to this, and that's something called a setting event. And setting events start to get beyond that antecedent behavior consequence just a little bit, and it starts to get into things that might be a little bit farther removed, or might just be kind of present in the environment, just in general, that might contribute to the problem behavior happening. Okay, in many cases, these are going to be things that make whatever the payoff for the student is even more valuable than it was. Okay, so the setting event might be something as simple as this probably isn't uncommon, right? That we have a situation where a teacher's working with a whole classroom worth of students, right? And so the teacher's totally on the other side of the room. There's lots of other students the teacher's interacting with. There's all this kind of stuff going on, right? There's and maybe that's been going on for a while. Maybe that's been going on. The student's been working for 15 minutes quietly, whatever the case may be, right? So we can think about these things, these sort of larger things, that they're not necessarily the immediate antecedent, but they're things that might be contributing to whether that problem behavior is happening. So that might be a possible setting event. So now we've got this. We actually sometimes we call the antecedent behavior and consequence the 3-term contingency. And when we get over here, we start to talk about adding the setting event, sort of makes it a 4-term contingency. So we've got the setting event, stuff that's going to go on that's going to influence the problem behavior by making the possible payoff more valuable. Then we've got the antecedent, the immediate thing, doing the alone work. The behavior is yelling. The consequence is the teacher coming over and saying, "What's wrong?" And we think that that's maintained by attention. Okay? So this is really important. All we've done here is say this is what's happening right now. Okay? And this is why we think it's happening. It's because of attention. So the rest of this is going to be figuring out, what do we do about this? Okay? What are we going to do about this? So the first thing that we want to think about is what an alternative consequence might be. So right now, the teacher's coming over and saying, "What's wrong?" And that's providing attention for the student, right? So at a very basic level, let's say that everything else stays exactly the same. Setting event is the same. Teacher's on the other side of the room. The antecedent is doing alone work. The behavior is yelling. We know that the teacher coming over and saying, "What's wrong?" is reinforcing that problem behavior of yelling, right? It's teaching the student, hey, if you yell, I'll come over and ask you what's wrong. So we don't want to do that, right? So our alternative consequence is, let's say everything went down just the way it's written out here. Our alternative consequence is, what can we do differently in that moment so that we make sure that we're not doing something that's going to teach the student that yelling is a good move, right? And this doesn't have to be punishing the student. It probably shouldn't be, certainly not as a first choice, right? But it might be as simple as, let's not provide any attention when that happens. So we hear the students yelling, we're just going to pretend that we don't hear the student yelling, right? So what that does at a very basic level as our alternative consequence is it takes what we think the function of the behavior is, which is attention, and it's like, okay, let's make sure we're not given that. Okay, let's at least not give that, so we're not teaching this bad lesson that we don't want to teach, okay? So that's our first step, coming up with an alternative consequence, which you can think about as something else you do that doesn't reinforce the behavior. Something else that you can do when the behavior happens that doesn't teach the student that that's the way that they ought to be behaving, okay? So that's a nice first step, but some of you may be thinking, oh yeah, sure. So we're not going to provide attention and the kid's just going to yell more, or they're going to start doing something else. They're going to get way more disruptive. So I have no choice but to go over and give them attention. And you know what? You're probably right. You're probably right. And so that's why this alternative consequence is a nice piece of the puzzle, but it cannot be the whole puzzle. It's not enough to just do this because it's not going to work, right? If all we do is stop providing the reinforcement, all we're going to get is the kid upping the ante until we have no choice but to deliver reinforcement, okay? And that's where replacement behavior comes in. And we see where replacement behavior is. It's coming in at the exact same place as the behavior. So in this case, as the yelling comes in. And we can think about a replacement behavior as being just what it sounds like. Okay? What is something we can use to replace yelling? And when we think about that, it's replacing yelling. What's something that we can do that can get the exact same result for this student that yelling is currently getting? And what's yelling currently getting? It's getting attention, right? So let's actually scoot over here because that might be a good way to frame this. So the consequence that we want is teacher attention, right? Because that's the same as this consequence, the teacher coming over and saying what's wrong. The student wants some kind of teacher attention. That's our hypothesis. So we want to think about what our replacement behavior could be for that. What's something else that student can do that's going to get teacher attention? That's not yelling, something that's more appropriate. And it might be as simple as raising their hand, okay? So the trick here is our replacement behavior is just something else the student can do to get that same need met as yelling, but that's not as problematic. The real rub here is that when that raising hand happens, when that replacement behavior happens, we have to make sure we're providing the consequence, right? Too often, problem behavior pops up because we've taught kids, not through our words, but through our actions, maybe we've taught kids that raising your hand doesn't work because there's a bunch of kids with their hands up and the teacher's like, whatever, I'll get to you when I get to you. It's going to take a little while. There's a lot of kids. But yelling right away, the teacher comes over and tries to, hey, what's wrong? And tries to shut that down, right? So they learn raising hand doesn't work that well, but yelling works really well. So our goal with this replacement behavior is to teach the student, nope, the replacement behavior is what works really well. The yelling doesn't work so well. Okay, so we've got to commit to when that hand, for this student, when that hand code goes up, we're immediately going over and providing that attention. Okay, that's the replacement behavior. Okay, so now we've got a good chunk of our problem behavior and competing behavior pathway done here. Okay, we know what we think is maintaining problem behavior. We know what we're going to do differently when that problem behavior happens, and we also know what we want to teach the student to do instead. Okay, which is a nice first piece of the goal. But ultimately, there's one other piece that we want to get to. Okay, and that one other piece is ideally, what do we really want the student to do? Yeah, raising their hand is nice, but what we really want the student to do is to be able to sit there and do their alone work without needing a whole bunch of attention and just to be able to get their work done, right? So how do we make that happen? If we say that our alternative behavior in this case is completing the alone work, okay, that's what we'd like the student to do, okay? What can we think about doing to make that more likely to happen? Well, let's think about what we might be able to change from a setting event modifications standpoint. So we know that the setting event was the teachers on the other side of the room. There's lots of other students, right? Some of this stuff we probably can't control. We may not be able to control the fact that there's lots of other students in our classroom and that they all might be vying for our attention. But we might be able to control the location of the student relative to the teacher. So maybe we say that we're going to have the student sit near the teacher's desk. Okay? Or we might just have the teacher make a plan to be in a little closer proximity to where the student is, right? That's a setting event modification because it's going to set the occasion for the ultimate reinforcer, which in this case was that teacher attention, to be a little less valuable in the moment. Well, okay, the teacher's right here. I guess I don't really need the teacher's attention. Or, I can smile at the teacher and the teacher can smile back. Or maybe one of our setting event modifications is provide attention every few minutes, right? Which could be as simple as the teacher making sure you catch that student's eye and give them a little smile. Give them a little pat on the back when you walk by. Give them a thumbs up, okay? Without anything that they're doing. So basically what you're doing is making that attention less valuable because they're getting a whole bunch of it anyway. So why do they have to engage in problem behavior to be able to get it? Why do they have to raise their hand when they know that you're going to be right there giving them a thumbs up? You're there for them. You're right next to them, right? So this is our setting event modifications. Our antecedent is pretty much going to stay the same. We're still doing alone work, right? That's what the assignment is, okay? But the difference is the alternative behavior here, because of our setting event modifications, our expectation and our hope is that the student is going to be able to complete that alone work, okay? And then what we're going to want to have is an alternative consequence. So what's something that can happen for this student when they complete their alone work that makes it worth their while to have done it? Okay? And ideally, it's going to be something that's more reinforcing than what they're getting from raising their hand, which is the teacher attention, right? So maybe this could be something like 5 minutes of a teacher one-to-one time, right? If they find attention really reinforcing, we're going to give them a little bit of special time, or maybe if they do a certain number of alone assignments without needing a teacher to come over and help them, they get to have lunch with the teacher at the end of the week, right? Or maybe for other students that are motivated by other things, it's tickets or tokens or little tangibles that they can get access to, all kinds of other things like that. But the bottom line is, this last piece of it is thinking about what do we want the student to do ultimately? What really is the goal here, right? How do we modify the setting so it makes it more likely the student's going to be able to be successful? And then what do we do after the student does that alternative behavior, what ultimately we wanted them to do, that's going to show them that that's the right thing to do? And really, at the end of the day, what we've just done here in all of these boxes is we've put together the real basics of a behavior plan. Okay, we've really thought about why is the student doing this, right? Which is our antecedent behavior consequence, as well as a little bit thinking about what the setting events are. So that's what's happening now. We've thought about what do we do when that problem behavior happens instead? That's not going to reinforce it. We can think about this as a response to a behavior to decrease. Okay, we've also thought about what's the skill that we want to teach this student? What's a better way for them to get what they want? And in this case, it's that raising of the hand, right? And getting that teacher attention. So we can think about this as our behaviors to increase. This is what we want to increase, and this is how we're going to do it. But then ultimately, we're thinking about how can we modify the environment. We can think about this as antecedent control, right? What do we change about what's going on in the environment in general that makes it more likely the student's going to be successful when they're doing their alone work, right? We think about what the alternative behavior is. Ultimately, what do we want the student to do to be able to be successful, to complete the alone work? And then what kind of reinforcement do we provide that's going to be valuable enough that it makes it worth the student's while to make that happen? So ultimately, when we're thinking about our problem behavior and competing behavior pathway, we're creating a behavior plan. And these are the boxes that we're going to be filling in that way, right? And again, what's cool about this is that if that hypothesis of function is different, the only box that's going to stay the same is the yelling. Every other box is going to change, right? So the behavior can look exactly the same, but if we think this is maintained by escape, right, then we might be thinking about an alternative consequence of let's not let the student escape from the situation, right? Maybe we've got a student that is given an assignment to do, and the teacher's riding them about doing it, and they engage in yelling, and the teacher sends the student to timeout. Okay? That's a classic pattern that has a hypothesized function of escape, right? The student's presented with this work, they don't want to do it, they yell, they get sent to timeout, so they don't have to do the work, right? So maybe our alternative consequence is to keep prompting them and not let them out. They don't get a timeout, right? And maybe the setting event is that it's a worksheet with a whole bunch of problems and it's really hard. Right? So if we think about, in that case, what our replacement behavior might be, again, we think now we think this is behavior that's maintained by escape. And let's go ahead and fill these in, right? So now, doing alone work, that's hard. Teacher prompting, right? And now the consequence is sent to timeout. Now we think this is probably behavior that's maintained by escape. So what we want to do in that case, let's think about an alternative consequence. How do we teach the student, hey, yelling is not the way that you get out of doing the work. We're just going to keep prompting to finish work, right? That might be what we do here, right? And then we think what our setting event might be. Maybe it's a worksheet with lots of hard problems on it, okay? And the teacher keeps prompting the student, let's go, you got to do this, get back to work, yelling, sent to timeout, right? Our alternative consequence is to keep prompting them to finish the work. We're not letting them out. What's our replacement behavior now? And again, we're thinking about what's something that serves the same purpose as yelling. Raising hand is not going to get it done anymore because the student isn't yelling to get attention. The student's yelling for what? To get escape, right? So in this case, maybe it's asking for a break. Can I take a break, please? Can I have 5 minutes? Okay? And the consequence in this case is going to be give the student a break, right? Which is a great intervention. It's a great thing to teach the student to be able to ask for a break. Some of you may be correctly thinking, well, yeah, that's all well and good, but you're just going to get a kid that's asking for a break all the time and is never getting any work done. True, right? But it's a nice first step. Asking for a break is better than yelling. But ultimately, we need to think about our alternative behavior is completing that work, okay? The antecedent is doing the alone work with the teacher prompting, right? The alternative behavior is completing the alone work. Let's think about our setting event modifications here, though. It's not about where the student is relative to the teacher. It's not about providing attention, because that's not what's going on with the student. This is a student that's presented with a worksheet that has lots of hard problems on it, right? So what we might do as a first step is we might reduce the number of problems, reduce difficulty, We might include high interest materials, right? These are all things that we can do that make that worksheet or that alone work that has to be done less aversive, right? It makes it less of a drag. And as a result, it's going to make the student more likely to be willing to do it, right? Just because it's not as bad as it was, right? And now we can think about what our alternative consequence is. They're probably not looking for teacher one-on-one time, but who knows? Maybe they are. But maybe what we're going to do is we're going to, if they get all their work done, maybe we're going to provide praise or provide tangibles, provide a little break. A break with, but we want to make the break better than the consequence for the replacement behaviors. Now it's a break with preferred items. Right? So you can see that by changing the context, by changing the hypothesized function from attention to escape, everything around it changes. And that's why the key here, the Rosetta Stone, is knowing what the function, or coming up with a hypothesis of what the function of that problem behavior is. And that's really going to drive what we're going to do about it, okay? And that's the other piece of this big final assignment is, okay, now we think we know, based on antecedents, behavior, consequences, we think we know why this student is engaging in the behavior they're engaging in. We've got a good hypothesis. So now what do we do about it, okay? And this problem behavior and competing behavior pathway answers that question. What do we do about it? Thanks for listening, and I'm looking forward to seeing your work.